Background, my name is Celeste Prawl, and I am the Administrative Coordinator for the Equality State Policy Center. And welcome to our People's Review Live. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to improve the lives of Wyoming's people through transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. The People's Review Live is designed to help people across Wyoming engage with our government and keep up with important issues and debates. When we work together, we can ensure transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. And that's never been more important than right now. This event is made possible by the generous support of our People's Review Live Circle members, Marcia Constell and Joe Albright, Joanne Skyam True and Shane True, Mike Chauncey and Kathy Jenkins, and an anonymous donor. If you'd like to know how to become a member of our leadership circle, please email me. I'll drop my email in the chat in just a second. And a little bit of housekeeping for everyone. So this is a webinar format. So right now you should be able to see and hear panelists and myself. If you can't, let us know and we will go ahead and sort that out for you. There is a Q&A feature for you guys to submit questions as well as through the chat, whatever works best for you, and we'll work our way through them this evening. Finally, as you heard, we're recording this panel, so that way anybody can watch it later. So before I pass it off to Ron, I'd just like to give a quick update that unfortunately Yevna, one of our panelists, cannot join us today, but we're still really excited to jump into the conversation. So with that, I will pass it off to our moderator tonight, Ron Sniffin, who is the treasurer for ESPC and the executive director of the Wyoming Education Association. Ron, thank you so much for being here tonight. We're really excited to have you.
Thank you, Celeste, and I'm very excited to introduce our panelists. I'll start with Briggs White. Briggs White serves as Deputy Executive Director of the Biden administration's Interagency Working Group, IWG, on coal and power plant communities and economic revitalization. In this role, he works hand in hand with the 11 federal agency members of the IWG to advance its mission. The IWG is identifying and coordinating opportunities to connect energy communities for federal investments to help ensure the shift to a clean energy economy creates good paying union jobs, spurs economic revitalization, remediates environmental degradation, and supports energy workers in coal, oil, and gas, and power plant communities. Prior to being appointed Deputy Executive Director, White was central to a multi-agency effort to prepare the IWG's initial report, which described existing mechanisms and provided recommendations for future actions that could support and revitalize the economies of energy communities. White joined the National Energy Technology Laboratory in 2007 and most recently served as a technology manager for 3 research and development programs on behalf of the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. Shannon Anderson, since joining the Powder River Basin Resource Council in 2007, Shannon has served as Powder River's main staff, working to address the impacts of coal mining and power plants and uranium mining on people and places in Wyoming. She also provides legal and organizing support on other energy issues, including oil and gas development. Shannon is a graduate of Grinnell College, and she received her JD from Lewis and Clark Law School in 2005. She also has a certificate in environmental and natural resources law from Lewis and Clark, and she is a member of the Wyoming Bar. Prior to joining the Resource Council, Shannon worked as a community economic development staff attorney at the Public Law Center in Orange County, California. Shannon has an extensive volunteer and professional experience in environmental advocacy and community organizing. Shannon lives in her hometown of Sheridan with her dog Scooby, and she spends her free time enjoying the beauty and solace of Wyoming's public lands. Chauffe Schirmer is proud to be a second-generation utility worker, following the footsteps of both her parents when she joined Utility Workers Union of America Local 127. Chauffe began her career with UWUA when she began work at the Jim Bridger Power Plant in Point of Rocks, Wyoming, and is now national representative for UWUA. Thank you all for being here tonight. And we have a lot of, I do have some prepared questions, but viewers, if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat or Q&A. So let's dive in. I'd like to start with a question for everyone. Just transitions is a complex topic. What do each of you believe just transitions is. And I'll start with Shannon.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. And thanks so much for Equality and State Policy Center for hosting this important dialogue about our state and kind of the moment in time that we find ourselves in and the future work that we have before us. When I think of what is a just transition, I think of a transition that is planned, well thought out, incorporates community feedback, acknowledges impacts and opportunities. And so that's really, I think, again, where Wyoming is right now and where we can be going forward. And it really, is different than what I would consider not to be a just transition and what we've seen in the coal industry at some point over the last few years, which is abrupt layoffs, mines that are left unreclaimed and left for communities to take care of. Those kind of situations are not a just transition. So again, when I think of what is a just transition, I think of foresight, planning, community involvement, and a really important role for the government.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shannon. Briggs, would you mind going next?
I actually think that was a great jumping off point. So appreciate those comments, Shannon, and thank you, Celeste and Ron, for having us here. I think the first thing is we have to recognize that these workers and communities have powered the nation and the economy for generations and have been in these places. And, it's no fault of theirs that the transition is occurring, and they need to be supported in their effort to make it through the transition and do whatever they want in their future. So I think to Shannon's point about community engagement, it's really important that that communities and workers are leading whatever vision and outcomes that they want. And that's going to look different in different parts of the country. But being part of the conversation and identifying those local challenges and then those local solutions and having that be driven really bottoms up, recognizing that not every place is going to look the same. And so that's the complexity of place-based transition and interventions, is that we sort of have to have customized interventions in different places. But nevertheless, it also represents an opportunity for the federal government in partnership with state government, local government, and all of the players that are part of this to sort of work together and try to make those bottoms up solutions a reality. But certainly no shortage of challenges there. But again, appreciate being part of this conversation tonight.
Thank you, Briggs. Chauffe?
Well, of course, as the last one to answer, most of my answers have already been spoken.
Sure.
I think both Shannon and Briggs were very accurate in their descriptions of what the overall goal of a just transition would include, making sure that communities and workers are involved in deciding the direction that we move into, rather than being an afterthought or the repercussion that is left behind after a transition is made. Shannon did mention, a very good example of what we don't want to happen, which is abrupt layoffs and communities disrupted when overnight workers attempt to show up to work and their workplace is literally chained off, the gate is chained closed, and they're left with nothing but questions and a lack of answers. So that's certainly not what we want to see. What workers, I believe, in my experience, want to see is support for transition out of an industry that, as Briggs mentioned, has literally existed for generations, and many people like myself are multi-generational working in these industries. So it becomes a sense of identity. How do you support workers transitioning from something that is core to what they see as their personal identity? A lot of that entails major support for transition and retraining to a new career. This isn't the type of training that you can do after a regular work schedule in the evening type of transition. These workers are working 10 or 12-hour shifts, often rotating days covering all days of the week, covering days, swing shift, graveyard shift. So a traditional community college, take a few classes and get a certificate, isn't a proper transition for these workers. We're talking potentially several years worth of wage support so that they can properly retrain for a career that they would choose, rather than just the next option that's available after they're laid off. So I think I'm probably jumping ahead in some of our questions, so I'll leave it at that.
You actually are, which is fine and logical. So an important part of the just transition principles, and many of you touched on this already, is to ensure that vulnerable communities are included in the conversations and not harmed by the transition. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how you think we can work together to ensure this? Let's see. Briggs, why don't I ask you to start?
Well, sure. So I think the first thing is, hats off to this organization for hosting a forum like this. I think that's an important opportunity. And, we've had conversations. We've tried to do our part, but also we recognize that there's lots of other conversations happening that are, we try to be supportive of that. And I think it's also useful sort of as a guiding principle, at least for us, is to say, well, if we have the private sector at the conversation, do we have organized labor, or do we have workers represented? If we have heavy industry, do we have the environmental groups represented? We try to bring that sort of 360 of stakeholder perspectives around a place, around a topic or an issue if we can, and try to take that extra step. It's usually easier to talk to, the National Trade Association or the large group that has the loud voice that's easy to find out about, but try to go that extra mile to say, hey, is there anybody else that needs to be part of this conversation? And we have had a few engagements actually in Wyoming. We held an event back in December where we did it via virtual because of the COVID situation, and had a robust dialogue. But honestly, it was the conversations with the communities ahead of time, with the county commissioners, with the local mayors, just with the stakeholders that were interested, where we really got down to, well, what is going on? What are the needs? What are the ideas out there? And just had those frank conversations. And so I feel like you need a balance between the big events where you have everybody together, but also some small group conversations where people feel a little more comfortable being frank with you. So that's just my 2 cents on it, and I'm sure the other speakers will have a point of view too.
Thank you, Briggs. Either Shannon or Chauffe, you want to jump in next? How about Chauffe?
Sure. I do think making sure, this is definitely a great forum as a starting off point. And as Briggs mentioned, the forum that was held in December and the preceding conversations with local stakeholders, local legislators, county commissioners, city councilmen, and mayors are all very important. I think we can expand the conversation and should be reaching out to companies to have discussions with their workers directly at the place where those workers are, literally in the workplace. Oftentimes these events, because of time zones and so forth, are held during the day. Again, if you're working a 10 or a 12-hour shift, you're likely not even home from work at 5 p.m. to be able to watch, let alone engage in a session such as this or a session during the day. If you're on a graveyard shift, you're sleeping to try and be rested and able to safely complete your job the next night. So the best way to engage workers would be to approach companies and have these conversations in their workplaces. And because of the number of workers we're looking at, I think that would be the best way to approach that. It's not like it's pockets of 5 or 10 people in individual companies. These are companies with oftentimes hundreds of employees in one location. That's where we need to take the conversation next.
Shannon,
Yeah. And Ron, I would just add, I think these conversations need to happen early, often, and as people have been mentioning, in a variety of different forums and with different stakeholders. There's just a real need to start right now to think about the Wyoming that we want to build together. It's not, a time to wait 5 years, 10 years to start having those conversations. Now really is the time. And it's a very community kind of focused conversation, but can also, I think, be benefited from state and federal leadership. So starting, at the top at our state government, and then also, at the federal level, and particularly for the Powder River Basin mines, recognizing that the federal government effectively created the coal industry in Wyoming in a lot of ways. It's federal coal that's being mined in the Powder River Basin. And so there's a real federal kind of responsibility there, actually, in terms of leadership and need, financial resources, whatever it is, to move the conversation forward on what's next in terms of, reclamation and making sure the mines get wrapped up and reclaimed. And again, the environmental stewardship is there, but also the community and worker perspective. So again, I think, the local level, as we've been talking about, is so important, but there also needs to be some real leadership, both from the state and the federal government.
So speaking of the federal perspective, I'll ask this of Briggs. Can you share some examples of what has worked in other communities around the nation, in other states and other communities?
Sure. Well, I think that, let's go to the other side of the country. So in Eastern Kentucky, Southern West Virginia, to Shannon's point, the transition has been occurring for a lot longer than it has been in Wyoming. And I think that just illustrates the point of why you need to start early. And so in places which there aren't, unfortunately, a lot of examples, but in places where people have started early, it certainly helps smooth that transition. And so, if utilities have been able to announce their plans and give lots of running room so that workers can start to understand their future, so that communities can start to plan, as opposed to having that uncertainty, which, as I understand it in Wyoming, that has been some of the issue in certain places, is that, it's the question, well, so we're going to hold on to the coal, or are we moving past the coal? And that indecision really just removes the opportunity to start doing that planning early. I would acknowledge that in our engagements over the last 6 months in Wyoming, though, it does feel like maybe the conversation has shifted. And from what I've heard in places like Kentucky and West Virginia, there wasn't always an appreciation for the transition. And there was a lot of that fight to hold on to the coal industry. And it's not that it's totally gone away, but I think there's a recognition that diversification can be a healthy part of the economy, and that, communities need to be supported in that process. And so, I think coming back to what else has worked, I think that where it has happened, coalitions that include strong support from an entity that can provide some form of cost sharing has been important. And again, that hasn't been everywhere, but in some cases it's the private sector, in some cases it's philanthropy, in some places it's the state. There are a few states around the country that are starting to be able to provide some level of support. I think that's a really important contribution. But whoever's providing the cost share, and also supporting the grant writing for that matter, that's critical, because these communities typically don't have the resources in order to provide the cost share match on federal grants. So I feel like those are just a couple of things that have been key ingredients to working, starting early, and finding entities that can support grant writing and cost sharing. Otherwise, we understand that navigating the federal government, a dozen federal agencies, literally hundreds of funding opportunities in a low capacity, isolated rural community, which most energy communities are rural and isolated, it's just incredibly difficult to do that, especially if you happen to be the mayor who's also working at the coal plant they don't have time to deal with that kind of stuff. So, you know, just a few thoughts there.
Thank you. Shannon or Chauffe, you want to speak to any of that last question at all, or I can move on? Looks like you're good. All right. So speaking of other states, in Colorado, it's my understanding that they saw legislation to create a Just Transition Advisory Committee to draft a recommendation for a transition plan. So maybe Shannon, I'll ask you this question first, and the others can chime in, and if you're aware of it. But what can we learn from this, and what do you think the Wyoming legislature could potentially do?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Ron. So Colorado has actually created an Office of Just Transition. They've now staffed up. They have multiple employees in that. It's a new kind of government agency in Colorado. It has staffing, again, funding, abilities to work with local governments, industry, kind of think through what, you know, again, the statewide Colorado plan is, but then also work at the local level. And I just think it's a good model. I don't know if it's the Wyoming model necessarily. You know, we need to think about where the funding comes from and whether, you know, some of us are not so keen into growing bureaucracy in the state. But again, it is, I think, a model where that dedicated staff has really made a big difference in terms of how they've been able to move the conversations forward. It's somebody's job to deal with this issue all the time, which makes it, again, I think, just moving forward at a different pace and scale than we've seen here in Wyoming.
Would anyone else like to share what maybe they've learned or heard from other states that might work or may not work in Wyoming? No worries. A minute ago, Chauffe, you mentioned one of the barriers potential for these transitioning workers is having the time or the right time to participate. What other barriers do you think may exist here in Wyoming?
You know, I think as I mentioned in kind of the intro, or my definition of a just transition is addressing, and Briggs hit on the point as well, that this transition isn't an attack on the workers who work in these industries, and it is not the fault of the workers in these industries that a transition needs to happen. And so that messaging has to be very clear. When a key part of your identity is part of a very contentious conversation on a national and even international basis, that can feel like an attack. But it also has to be, you know, we do have a lot of conversations around supporting workers through a transition, but it's very hard to bring that to fruition, to bring that to actionable steps that workers can actually see. And so that becomes a difficulty. I think Briggs's introduction mentioned the Biden administration's support for good family sustaining union jobs. And of course, utility workers believe that union jobs are a key component of making sure that these are, in fact, family sustaining jobs as we transition, but also that the people transitioning out of certain industries have negotiated contracts with their employers to be able to help hold employers and companies accountable to what they mention. I think there was also a point, Briggs, you mentioned that utilities are, or in instances where utilities have been able to announce their plans, that helps communities transition better. I think we should be flipping that phrase, or maybe just a key word in there, instead of having, if utilities have been able to, utilities should be required to announce their plans and be part of making the transition become a reality. These companies do offer public service in providing utilities to communities, but they also make a profit, and they have made very generous profits for a very long time. And there is a responsibility that should be due back to communities and their workers to make sure that workers are not just left out in the cold, having the rug pulled out from under them, left wondering what their next step should be, because that's when people make hasty decisions, choose careers that are not long-term careers. They take whatever's available because they have to support their families. And that's when people leave places like Wyoming, because if there aren't other opportunities already in place for people to move into, and they're not able to move into those opportunities, then people leave. And if we have an exodus of energy workers from Wyoming, it will be a very difficult task to bring people back who want to live and work here. We have a lot of people who do move in for jobs and decide this isn't the place for them for any number of reasons. Wind probably being a big part of it. But, you know, it's important to try to keep the people who live here and want to be here, rather than having it become a ghost town and then trying to repopulate after some change in the future.
Any other
Yeah,
comments?
but Ron, if I could,
Yes.
answer, I think one piece, of course, that is always the elephant in the room in Wyoming is the revenue side of things, right? So that is, I would say, always, that's the number one barrier we have as a state, is to sort of think about, again, not only building a new economy with a new job force, what that looks like in our communities with quality of life and other things that we can attract and build together. But it's the revenue piece that is incredibly challenging to think about. And so not only are we dealing with communities that are losing a workforce, but they're losing, their property tax base, state level, severance taxes, federal level. There was an article out today on Coley's bonus bids, right? I mean, those days are over. And so we're trying to figure out a way to not only, I think, have a vibrant economy and workforce, but also that state budget. And with that, like what we don't want, again, as part of a just transition, is to lose essential services, safety nets, the important things that we have as a state that creates value for our citizenry and our families. And so, thinking about a way to, again, build that bridge and starting the conversation as soon as possible is really important.
And Ron, if I could just
Please,
follow
this
up
is
with
the
one point.
conversation. Yes.
Shannon, you mentioned a great point in the social services and the funding, the revenue aspect. Briggs, in our panel from December that we had to talk about transition for communities, I believe it was Mr. Anderson who brought up a point about how many jobs, both directly and indirectly, are supported by the energy industry. And I want to say that overall, it was 1 in 5 jobs in Wyoming. We need to remember that it's not just the number of people employed at a power plant or a coal mine that are affected. It is all of the community jobs, the teachers, the EMTs, the hospital staff that are often funded by revenues and the tax base provided from those employees, along with their families who live and work in these communities, work in the service industry, provide childcare for other families. These are all things that break down if we suddenly remove hundreds of people and entire industries from a community. And if anyone remains in that community, they are stunted for opportunities, because how does anyone go to work if they don't have childcare? How does anyone provide for medical services if it's literally hundreds of miles away, or where communities in Wyoming are literally facing the end of ambulance services because funding isn't there and is lacking? How do you envision a life with aged parents or long-term illnesses in your family if you don't have these services? That's a big part of the question that remains.
So just building on that and of the theme of barriers, a couple here. One, and this isn't specific to Wyoming, but being rural and isolated, in which many of these energy communities are, they have low capacity, and probably many of the players that are so important in these stories were never expected to be applying for federal funding. Like, that's not their background. They're not trained in economic development and dealing with the federal government. They were just living their life, and now they find themselves in the middle of a transition. And so, I think we need to try to make it easier for them to navigate that. And so that's what we're trying to do with the federal government. I also want to focus in on the worker a little bit, and like what Chauffe was saying, yes, some of them might be willing to do like a CDL training course and go into truck driving, which is a hugely in-demand industry right now and part of the supply chain. But many may decide they want to go into a different career, which to her point may require a lot more time training. You're not going to just go get that done. And if you're going to take the time to do that training, you're going to need some benefits or some support or something. You can't just not have employment for all the time that it's going to take for that training. And so I guess in my mind, that's a real barrier. We offer federal funding both through DOL for the dislocated worker grants, as well as there's lots of workforce training through DOL, through DOE, and in the Appalachian region through the Appalachian Regional Commission. But I think it's fair to say that I'm not sure that we've provided everything that we could there, and it would be. I feel like that's a real challenge. How do you go from that point where you've decided to move on, or unfortunately you've heard that you have to move on, and then you got to make it through that transition? That seems like a real barrier for workers.
Definitely. We are getting a couple of questions and comments in the chat. I'll reference one of those first. Lindsay references that in a recent Public Utility Commission meeting, Rocky Mountain Power was asked to present on the community transition plan they committed to building with local leaders around the Naughton plant in their 2019 IRP action plan. And she feels that their response was astoundingly lacking in detail and pasted some of the language. But the bottom line question is, how can we hold utilities accountable to their commitments? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I would defer to Chauffe, I think, if she has anything she wants to say specifically on this one. But, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to, again, treat these corporations as something to hold accountable. And when they make promises, they need to keep them. And it's part of all of us, I think, to make sure that happens. I mean, from a conservation group perspective, if they make a commitment to do reclamation well or environmental cleanup, we hold them accountable for that. And it's the same thing for, community plans or worker plans or any other announcements they've had. And I think, I'm glad that the Public Service Commission had that conversation. I think it's, they've been also doing well, I think, to create some accountability for the utilities. The legislature has been creating some accountability. I think we all just need to keep doing more of that to make them as transparent as possible going forward.
I think you make great points, Shannon. And I would point to, your bio mentioned background in community organizing. I think that's a huge part of what needs to happen. Real local town hall meetings and discussions about how we can hold companies. And it's not just utilities, it's companies of all sizes and in all industries when they change directions or change plans. I think a bigger part of that also becomes possibly, the funding wherewithal, whether that's philanthropic or public funding, to actually have resources to hold them accountable, much like environmental groups have resources to hold companies accountable to their environmental cleanup and reclamation. When companies make promises that they don't keep to their workers and communities, there should probably be some funding to help make that happen from whatever source that can come from. And I think on a bigger scale, it's a much bigger conversation than just here in Wyoming or one company. Bankruptcy reform is a huge part of it. When a company locks workers out of a work site and files for bankruptcy, literally will not allow them to access their own personal property in the form of steel-toed boots or tools or equipment that they had on that property. And through bankruptcy courts, the top level executives are receiving millions of dollars in bonuses, and hedge fund investors actually come out ahead of what they've invested in that company, while workers are left without pay that they're due for work they actually performed. And smaller companies, suppliers in the area are stiffed on accounts that have been racked up with possibly supplies and inventories that they'll never get reimbursed for, because they don't have huge coffers to fight to get any of that money back. That's where we find this real sense of those unjust transitions, that these companies file for bankruptcy, reorganize a bit, have a new name, and seem to be doing just fine and probably ahead of the game because now they've gotten rid of all their debt. But the actual people in that community can't just wash away that debt. They can't just say, oh, I'm no longer this person, I now have a new name, so I get to start fresh. It's not the same and it's not fair. And that's a big part of the injustice that happens.
Any other comments there? Okay. As we all know, in Schirmer, they're converting a coal-powered power plant to nuclear. Can you share with me your perspective of how we could apply just transitions in that example? Or not?
Well, I'll just say a few comments from a DOE perspective.
Okay.
DOE is providing funding for that. And in our minds, that's if that's what the local utility or the local community wants to do, then we're supporting that with funding in just the same way that if in a different place somebody wants to put a windmill or a solar panel on an abandoned mine land or do controlled environment agriculture instead of where they used to mine coal, then we want to support whatever the locally driven solution is. And so, I guess that's sort of from a philosophy perspective, one thing. In this case, I think we can also support that community with a transition. Yes, they're hopefully going to have a nuclear reactor that will sustain the local tax base and hopefully provide some source of occupation for the workers that wish to move into that facility. So that's positive, but we also know that there's going to be huge needs in terms of having a elegant transition with the amount of construction labor that's going to occur. There's going to be huge taxes on the local infrastructure, whether it's police or roads or food services and that kind of thing. So, we also are doing our best to offer services through the federal government as well as through the state government, because again, a lot of the federal government funding, particularly for infrastructure, winds up actually going to the state as an intermediary before it goes to the eventual entity. So in that regard, we're also working with the state of Wyoming. And we just say that, if there are needs that are identified, we're happy to help. We have our federal field staff from the various agencies that I just mentioned, for example, EPA, EDA, USDA, DOE, on the ground in Wyoming, and they're talking to the folks in the communities and hearing these needs. And so we're trying to help them out with technical assistance and other things. At the end of the day, as I mentioned, we can't write the grant proposal. So there is a bit of a limit, and that's where we need other entities to step in and provide the support for those low capacity communities so they can take advantage of that federal funding. But we are trying to make sure that our federal field staff are engaged so that they can have those conversations and help them find their way to the federal funding.
You may have already answered this question from Julia, but I'll read it anyway. You may want to add to it. Briggs, a 2020 Brookings report found that federal aid programs for rural communities is outdated, fragmented, and incoherent. Can Mr. White please share with the IWG what the IWG is doing to ameliorate some of those issues for rural energy communities?
Sure. The first thing is I'll give credit actually to the Rural Prosperity Network, which was just announced last week. So this is a collaboration between the USDA and the Domestic Policy Council to put a focus on rural parts of the country. They announced 2 cohorts. The first cohort will include dedicated staff that are trained on the ground in the equities and the capabilities of multiple agencies. So hopefully a community member only has to have one conversation. That's not everywhere. There's just an initial cohort announced. They're planning on having a second cohort with additional communities later this year. Additionally, they're identifying what they're calling rural desk officers. So each agency will identify either a person or they'll do it by committee, depending on how they're structured, so that hopefully there'll be sort of a one-stop shop at each agency for rural related issues. So that also will be helpful. And then they're also going to build out a website. It's really just basically an online brochure at this point, but the idea is that they're going to build out resources specifically with rural folks in mind. Through the infrastructure task force, the White House produced a playbook that is basically a compendium of all the funding opportunities that are specifically directed towards rural communities. So there's a number of things that are ongoing. I'll just also focus specifically on the IWG, which is that while not every energy community is rural, there's certainly power plants inside of cities and that kind of thing. A lot of energy communities are rural. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about things like, does this rural community have broadband access? And if so, we're trying to give the outreach around the historic amount of funding that's through the infrastructure bill for broadband, for example. It's not particularly targeted to rural communities, but we know that in rural communities, it's critical for things like education, access to telehealth, economic development, remote work. If you want to stay in Wyoming, but maybe work from someplace else, you probably need some broadband. So, we try to, both through our outreach as well as through our funding clearinghouse, we tailor the funding opportunities that we put in there. First of all, if it's targeted to energy communities, we put it in. That's a no-brainer. But after that, we say, well, what else would be of interest to energy communities? And a lot of our thinking there is, well, is this really focused on rural communities? If it is, then we give it a hard look. And if we think that it's relevant, then we put it in there. So that's sort of our approach. And, we're certainly leaning into USDA rural development. They have a nice ground game, but also our other federal agencies that have strong presences in rural parts of the country. Really, wherever the energy communities are, that's where we're trying to focus, our attention. But thanks for the question, Julie. Appreciate it.
Yeah, really good. So we've been talking about the impact on workers, and if we have a minute, maybe we can speak to, and this was a prompt from Julia as well, how do we address how we can diversify away from the reliance on fossil fuel derived revenues for our services? Can the panelists share their thoughts on how to transition Wyoming's government services off the fossil fuel tax base? What can Wyoming citizens do? What support can the federal government offer? Anyone want to tackle that? Shannon.
I'll start. I mean, I have a few ideas, but I'm interested to hear what other people have to say too. I mean, the first thing I would highlight again for Wyoming that those of us in the state know, we have a permanent mineral trust fund. We have a sovereign wealth fund that is a tremendous resource and asset for the state of Wyoming. And so I always start there and kind of thinking about what our future looks like, because the reason we built that fund was so that we would have a time when fossil fuels weren't around and those non-renewable resources have been, exploited and extracted, and we would have money left. So that was the purpose of that fund. And it actually is the second largest source of revenue. The capital gains and interest on that account has, been tremendously helpful for state revenue and services. So the more we can do, in my opinion, and our organization has supported that fund since its very beginning, to build that fund, make sure it's invested well and kept well. That's number one for me, is our savings account has to be priority. And then from there, you have to look at ways to bring in additional tax revenue from different ways, whether it's, taxing tobacco and beer more. I mean, that's a perpetual issue at the legislature, or, thinking about streaming services. I thought that bill actually should have moved a lot easier than it did. I mean, I pay for streaming services like most of us do, and it's like, why don't I pay taxes on that? A lot of states have that source of revenue. Why doesn't Wyoming? So there, I think there's some low-hanging fruit in terms of maybe diversifying. And then, there's the bigger issues like income taxes, wind taxes, solar taxes, other kinds of bigger conversations that we definitely need to have, and need to really kind of get beyond the mindset of just saying no, but thinking about, what do we do? And again, thinking long-term, but starting the conversation now.
I'll take a shot at that. I just pulled up some notes from a conversation we had with some local electeds in Converse County. And I think this just gives you sort of a flavor of some of the options that they were proposing. And because who are we to say what they should do? I mean, this is up to the local folks. They were talking about nuclear. They were talking about plastics manufacturing. They were talking about ranching and agriculture, tourism, transportation. Also for renewables, recognizing that getting the power onto the grid is a challenge, and they were flagging barriers around sort of the patchwork nature of public and private lands and putting up electrical infrastructure for transmission. Which of course, there's a huge amount of money available through the infrastructure bill for transmission, but if you build the renewables, you got to get it somewhere. So. There's just sort of a smattering to kind of think about a little bit. And, obviously, we heard a lot about keeping carbon in the industry, but diversifying away from burning it for thermal purposes for power generation. So taking CO2, if you can do CO2 capture and do CO2-based utilization to make products with it, taking carbon and making graphite or other value-added products out of carbon, not necessarily steel making, metallurgical kind of things or thermal power generation, but using carbon, using rare earth elements and critical minerals that you can get through those extraction services. Again, I know that there's environmental issues and that may not be everybody's cup of tea, but we certainly heard that a lot. And again, who are we to say what they should be doing? But a variety of different opportunities for diversification were shared with us.
Yeah, and to that, I would just jump in real quick and say we need to lift that manufacturing tax exemption, because if we do any of that, we may not actually get revenue on it. So again, thinking of, just the revenue structure of Wyoming is a challenge. So. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions or comments from the viewers? I have gone through my questions. Any other comments from the panelists? Any closing remarks?
Well, I'll close with thank you to having us here this evening. I really enjoyed the conversation, and if we haven't met for the attendees, love to meet you. If you'd like to join our stakeholder database to receive a newsletter, we send out a newsletter with updates on federal funding opportunities, events, and other notifications on about an every other week basis. There's just so much going on right now that we were doing it monthly, but we've had to speed it up just because they were getting so long. So feel free to do that. And then, all of our events are open to the public. So, not that we do that many of them, but I'm sure we'll be back in Wyoming at some point. So love to hear your thoughts. If you want to shoot an email or just sign up and attend one of our events, happy to have you. So again, thanks again for having us here, and let us know if we can help.
Yeah, I just really appreciate the conversation, and great fellow panelists, and thanks, Ron, for your leadership and knowledge as well, and ESPC's good work on all of these issues, and bringing labor and conservation and social justice groups together the way that ESPC has for so many years. So thanks.
And I also want to extend my thanks to ESPC, to Shannon and Powder River Basin Resource Council, as well as to Briggs and the Biden administration and the IWG for all the work to have these conversations in a variety of settings and sessions. It's certainly talking about it is the first step to creating action. So I look forward to solutions that we might be able to come up with. I did just see a question come through the chat from a participant that how will a just transition be addressed in a non-union environment like Northeast Wyoming? And my thoughts on that are that it should be very similar to in a union setting, except it would require stakeholders, that those workers should with community organizing to create those stakeholders, that every worker is in fact a stakeholder in this transition and how it can affect and should be handled for the community. So those workers, their families, the teachers who teach in the schools, the nurses and doctors who work in the hospitals in Northeast Wyoming, even when there isn't a union contract, because that's not a fail-safe, that's not a concrete guarantee of what happens if a company files bankruptcy, but community action can put pressure and can also simply present the need for transition and for fair solutions to come forward. I won't say that every company makes a decision in a out of a sense of or a need to do harm or a lack of care about doing harm. If communities and workers aren't expressing what they see as problems and possible solutions, then that can be hard for anyone to implement. So definitely get together, brainstorm ideas, reach out to resources and ask for funding, reach out to entities like the Interagency Working Group or the desk agents that we were talking about to have these conversations and to express what is needed in your area. What I need in Rock Springs is very different than what might be needed in Gillette. And that needs to be addressed on a very specific basis for the areas that are being served. So thanks for that question. And thank you all for the opportunity. Thanks to ESPC for having People's Review and the live sessions like this about such an important topic and all the topics that they cover.
And I definitely want to thank the panelists. Fantastic job tonight. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, viewers, for attending. And Celeste, I'll pitch it over to you to close us out.
Awesome. Again, just want to reiterate all those thank yous. We're really grateful for all of you for joining us, both our panelists and our attendees, and special thanks to Ron for moderating tonight. Just want to give a reminder that the Equality State Policy Center is a 501c3 organization, and as such, we rely on charitable gifts to fund our work. Donations can be made at equalitystate.org or mailed to our office at 419 South 5th Street in Laramie, Wyoming, 82070. Again, you can email me if you'd like to join our leadership circle donors, which include Marcia Constell and Joe Albright, Mike Chauncey and Kathy Jenkins, Joanne Skyam True, Shane True, and an anonymous donor. A very special thanks to them for making tonight possible. And we look forward to seeing you guys next month for our People's Review Live. Have a great evening, everyone.